A sudden downpour hit, so heavy that even the wipers on my brand new Lexus gave up. I pulled over, rushed into a cafe, and accidentally saw my husband also taking shelter from the rain inside. But he wasn't alone. Another woman was sitting on his lap. It took exactly 1 second. His face went pale the moment he saw me. His body froze, forcing the woman to ask 3 times, "Are you okay?" When she got no answer, she turned around and instantly jumped to her feet like she'd been electrocuted. I stumbled 2 steps backward when I realized who she was. But before I tell you who she was, the person that shocked me so much, please hit the like button and comment below the city you're living in. I'll tell you right now, my name is Vera, 36 years old, and I'm a heart surgeon. That Tuesday afternoon, Boston was suddenly hit by heavy rain. Not the usual August drizzle, but an abnormal downpour, the kind with wind that whipped across the street like the city itself was trying to keep me there. I left the hospital later than usual, my lab coat still smelling of antiseptic, my mind exhausted after an 8-hour surgery on a veteran injured in a car accident. As I drove past the Back Bay area, the rain became so intense that even with the wipers on full speed, they couldn't clear the windshield fast enough. I had no choice but to turn into a familiar cafe near Beacon Street, a place I had stopped by countless times after work, just to breathe for a few minutes before heading home. I pushed the door open. A small bell chimed amidst the warm aroma of roasted coffee. And then, in exactly 1 second, my world froze. In a shadowed corner near the window, my husband Corbin, the head of a large insurance company, was sitting there, not alone. A blonde woman sat fully on his lap, her arms wrapped around his neck, her body pressed against his like it was the only seat she'd ever known. His hand rested on her stomach, not a casual touch, but the familiar intimacy of those who had done this far too many times. When he looked up and saw me, his face went pale in an instant. I saw his throat tighten, as if he'd just been punched breathless. The woman on his lap froze the moment she sensed the shift. She tilted her head to look at him, frowning slightly, whispering, "Corbin, what's wrong?" He didn't answer. She asked again, her voice sharper now, but his eyes were still locked on me, like he was paralyzed. On the third try, when she still got no response, she followed his gaze. And in that exact moment, her face drained of color, eyes wide with panic. She jumped off his lap as if electrocuted, her coffee cup clattering to the floor with a sharp crash that pierced the buzz of the crowded cafe. And it was then, just then, that I couldn't believe my own eyes. I staggered back 2 steps when I realized who she was. Jordana. Jordana, the woman engaged to Holden. Holden, my best friend since high school in Boston, who had stood by me through the hardest times of my life. I stood frozen, took one reflexive step back, my mind blank. But every piece fell into place with cruel precision. I understood in that moment that this wasn't just about my husband betraying me. This was a layered betrayal between two families, two of the closest relationships I had ever trusted. In the middle of a crowded cafe, I didn't stay another second. I didn't walk over, didn't ask, didn't scream like people always imagine a betrayed wife would. I turned around, pushed the door open, and walked out, leaving behind the smell of hot coffee, the clinking of spoons on cups, and two people caught in a moment they thought would never come. The Boston rain was still coming down hard, cold and brutal. As I got into my car, the rain pounded so violently against the windshield that I didn't need the radio anymore. It screamed loud enough to replace all the questions I wasn't ready to face. I drove almost on autopilot. Streets I knew by heart suddenly felt unfamiliar. Traffic lights seemed to last longer than usual, and memories in my head rushed by faster than I could process. Just minutes after I left the cafe, my phone began to vibrate. First call, then a second, then one after another, nonstop. When I stopped at a red light near the Charles River, I glanced down at the screen. It was the 12th call. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the number had climbed to 23. I didn't answer once, not because I didn't hear them, but because I knew exactly what I'd hear if I did. Hastily patched up lies, excuses cobbled together in panic. The phone fell silent for a few minutes, then buzzed again, a voicemail. I played it on speaker while parked by a roadside lot. His voice came through, shaking but trying to stay calm. "Vera, everything you saw was just a misunderstanding. I can explain. Please give me a chance to explain." I stopped the message halfway through, not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I'd already seen too much. There are images that, once they enter your eyes, no explanation can erase. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the rain slide down the windshield in rivulets. In that moment, I understood that if I let myself react emotionally, I would lose control, and I could not allow that to happen. I opened my messaging app, slowly typed out the words, and sent the same message to both Corbin and Jordana. Just one short sentence, emotionless, with no explanation. "Rest assured, I won't do anything foolish like you two might be hoping." I hit send, placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, and for the first time since stepping into that cafe, I took a deep breath. I knew very well that message wouldn't give them peace. It would terrify them. Because for those who are hiding guilt, the scariest thing isn't a scream. It's the silence of the one who saw everything but hasn't said a word. I knew it, and they would soon realize it too. The message I had just sent wasn't reassurance. It was a void large enough for the imagination of guilty people to gnaw at them all night long. I imagined my husband staring at his phone screen, waiting for a follow-up message that would never come. I imagined Jordana reading the sentence over and over, trying to guess whether I was angry, devastated, or preparing something far worse. My phone vibrated a few more times, missed calls, undelivered messages, then silence. That silence wasn't because they had calmed down, but because they had begun to fear. Fear that I had told Holden, fear that I had taken more photos, fear that I was sitting somewhere calmly planning something in a state of control they could no longer grasp. I didn't need to do anything else that night. The waiting itself was already the first punishment. I started the car, drove straight toward downtown, but didn't turn onto the familiar road that led to our house. I wasn't ready to walk into that 3-bedroom home where everything had suddenly become suspicious. The sofa, the bed, the quiet evenings I had once believed were peaceful. I steered toward Back Bay and stopped in front of the Mandarin Oriental. The hotel glowed with light, calm and detached from everything I had just left behind. When I received the room key from the front desk, my voice sounded strangely composed as I said my name. I pulled my small suitcase into the elevator, the doors closing behind me, reflecting my face in the cold metallic surface. No tears, just a heavy emptiness pressing down on my chest. In the room, I placed my phone on the desk, turned off the ringer, and stood for a long time by the window, looking down at Boston at night. The city kept functioning as it always did, and I was standing on the thinnest line between becoming a betrayed wife in silence and a woman about to decide with her own hands what happens next. That night, I barely slept, not because I was crying, but because old memories kept rising slowly but persistently, as if my brain was forcing itself to audit all the relationships that had once been the foundation of my life. Holden appeared first in that stream of memories. I had known him since the final years of high school in Boston, back when everything was still simple and sincere. We were in the same class, studied for exams together, and went through the kind of times where friends could become a second family. To me, Holden was always more like an older brother than anything else, someone who understood me deeply enough that we never had to say too much. Jordana came later, when we were already in college. She loved Holden with intensity, stood by him for over 10 years, from when they were both struggling to when his career finally began to take shape. I used to think that kind of endurance was proof of love, but over time I started to notice the fleeting glances Jordana would give every time Holden and I talked, the seemingly casual questions that always carried a hint of suspicion, the uncomfortable silences only those involved could feel. She never said it, but the jealousy was always there, quiet and relentless. The truth is, between Holden and me, there was never anything that crossed the line of friendship. No ambiguous messages, no inappropriate touches, not a single moment that needed hiding. And, ironically, it was that very purity that made Jordana more uneasy. Because when there's no fault to hold on to, people start imagining far worse things. And I realized that the past I had thought was solid had likely already been distorted in Jordana's mind long ago, long enough for her to believe that if not me, then there would always be some other woman she'd have to defeat. And I suddenly understood that in the story, perhaps I had never truly been Jordana's threat, just her excuse. The next morning, just after I finished my morning shift, my phone vibrated non-stop inside the pocket of my lab coat. I didn't even need to check to know who it was. When I unlocked the screen, the number made me exhale softly. 12 missed calls, all from Jordana. Then came a long message, her tone shifting from pleading to anxious, begging me for a chance to explain things clearly. I didn't respond right away. I let that message sit unread for nearly an hour, then replied with a single short line, cold yet polite enough. "We can meet." We arranged to meet at a small tea shop near the hospital, a place I often stopped by for a few quiet minutes between shifts. The shop was bright with large glass windows, private but not suffocating. I arrived first, picked a table near the window, and ordered a pot of hot tea. When Jordana walked in, I immediately noticed something was different. A loose coat, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach as she sat down, her figure no longer as lean as the last times I had seen her. In that moment, I knew. No need to ask. Jordana avoided my eyes, her voice small and quick, like she had rehearsed. "You misunderstood. I was just asking your husband for help with maternity insurance. He works in the insurance industry, you know." She gave a strained smile, unconvincing. I didn't interrupt. I just glanced down at the slight bulge beneath her clothes, something the lighting in the cafe couldn't hide. The signs of pregnancy were too obvious to be called a misunderstanding. I didn't argue. I didn't ask anything more. I opened my phone, placed it gently on the table, and turned the screen toward her. The photo from the cafe appeared clear, unambiguous. Jordana on Corbin's lap, her arms around his neck, his hand resting exactly where she was now trying to hide. The room was so quiet I could hear a spoon clink against a teacup. Jordana looked at the image, her lips moving, but no sound came out. No more explanations, no more stories about insurance advice, just the truth lying bare between us, cold and undeniable. Jordana stared at the phone screen for a few more seconds, then slowly pushed it back toward me like it was something filthy she didn't want to touch. She remained silent for a long time, long enough for me to realize one thing. She wasn't ashamed. What was unfolding in Jordana's mind at that moment wasn't regret, it was calculation. When she looked up, her eyes had changed, hardened, sharper, and completely devoid of the earlier panic. "You don't understand the whole situation," Jordana said, her voice dropping, carrying a restrained frustration. "It's way more complicated than what you saw." And then, as if rehearsed, she started turning everything back on me. She spoke of pressure, of moments of weakness, of how I somehow had made things harder just by being too close to Holden. The way Jordana talked, I was no longer the betrayed one, but the troublemaker. Then she brought up Holden, not as the man she loved, but as a shield. "You know how much he loves me," Jordana said, her voice slowing, layered with implication. "We're getting married, over 10 years together. Do you really think if he had to choose, he'd believe you?" That question didn't need an answer. It was a threat wrapped in calm words. Jordana wanted me to understand that if I spoke up, I wouldn't just destroy a relationship, I'd be labeled the jealous one, the woman who invented her own tragedy. "You're a doctor," she continued, her lips curling into a thin smile. "You're smart. You know how people will see this. A photo can be interpreted. A moment can be twisted." I listened without interrupting, my expression unchanged. The more Jordana spoke, the clearer it became that what she feared most wasn't the truth. It was the fact that I now controlled the narrative. She had no idea that from the moment she sat down at this table, I had turned on the recorder in my lab coat pocket. Every word, every accusation, every veiled threat had been captured,
clear and intact. I didn't need to reveal that yet. I just had to sit there letting Jordana expose her true self and let her believe that in this game I was still just the woman backed into a corner. The next morning, I left the hotel earlier than usual and drove to my therapist's office in the South End, a place I had visited a few times during the most stressful years of my career as a heart surgeon. The familiar room, soft lighting, and faint scent of essential oils stood in contrast to the chaos unfolding in my mind. As I recounted everything from the cafe in the rain to the tea shop meeting, she didn't interrupt once. She just listened, occasionally nodding as if confirming something all too familiar. When I finished, she paused for a few seconds, then asked a question very slowly, very clearly. "Do you see the pattern?" I looked at her, about to respond, when she continued, her voice calm but firm. "This is a classic pattern of manipulation. It starts with pleading to buy time. When pleading no longer works, they shift to blaming to make the victim doubt themselves. And when both fail, the final step is always a threat, not of violence, but of fear. Fear of being isolated, misunderstood, or seen as the destroyer." As she spoke, I felt something shift slightly in my chest. Not pain, but clarity. I asked her the question that had haunted me all night. "Should I tell Holden right now?" She shook her head gently. She said it wasn't because Holden didn't deserve the truth, but because the truth must come at the right time. Without irrefutable evidence, speaking up would only turn everything into an emotional dispute, where the manipulator has the upper hand. She advised me to wait, to observe, to let them continue revealing themselves, and most importantly, not to let emotion drive my actions.
I left the therapy office feeling completely different than when I walked in. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I understood now that clarity doesn't come from suppressing emotion, but from putting it in its rightful place. And for the first time since the rain at the cafe, I knew exactly what I was doing and why I hadn't told Holden yet, at least not now. I returned to the hotel, closed the door behind me, and for the first time in days, I opened my laptop with a very clear purpose. Not to escape, not to wallow, but to examine the numbers, the one thing in this marriage that had never learned to lie. I logged into the joint account Corbin and I shared, the one I rarely checked because I always assumed it was used for routine family expenses. But just minutes into scrolling through the statements, I realized how long that trust had been exploited. Certain charges began to repeat with strange regularity. Luxury hotels in Boston and New York booked on nights I was on call or away at medical conferences. A silent trip to Hawaii. No photos, no stories ever shared at home. And then a transaction that made me pause for a long time. Louis Vuitton, $12,000. Not a birthday gift I ever received, not an item I ever picked. It was for someone else, paid for with our shared money in a manner so casual it was brazen. I kept scrolling. 2 more transactions appeared, spaced a few weeks apart, both at the same place, a private gynecology clinic. My heart slowed for a beat. As a cardiologist, I'm trained to read numbers, timelines, and seemingly scattered details to form a bigger picture. And in that moment, everything began connecting in a chillingly coherent way. The timing of those payments matched when Jordana's body started changing, matched the days Jordana claimed to have urgent business trips, matched the period when I, in my naivety, still believed I was living in a normal marriage. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. A thought I had never allowed myself to entertain now surfaced with disturbing clarity, impossible to avoid. If Jordana is pregnant, and if these expenses have nothing to do with Holden, then the most likely, most logical possibility is that the child isn't his, it's my husband's. I didn't need to draw conclusions yet. I just needed to remember this feeling. The moment doubt stopped being emotion and became a hypothesis that demanded proof. And I knew that from that moment on, I wouldn't just listen to the stories they told. I would follow the trail of truth, one number at a time. As the financial facts began lining up in my mind, an old memory resurfaced with sudden clarity. A few months ago, during a routine checkup at the hospital where I work, Holden and I chatted briefly after his appointment. He happened to mention Jordana with a hint of unease in his voice.
He said she had changed a lot lately, dressing more boldly, wearing heavier makeup, using expensive perfumes she used to mock as flashy. Most notably, Jordana had started carrying designer handbags far beyond what her job at the jewelry store could reasonably afford. When Holden asked, she simply laughed and said they were gifts from loyal clients. Back then, I didn't think much of it, but now, with all the pieces beginning to fall into place, I understood that Holden may have suspected something. He just didn't want to believe it. And that very denial had allowed everything to stretch this far. I sat for a long time by the hotel window, watching cars stream along the streets of nighttime Boston, and I realized something very clearly. What was driving me now was no longer pain, it was the need for more evidence, not to feed my anger, but to leave no room for them to deny the truth. I knew phones are often the most revealing archives of guilt. Messages can be deleted, words denied, but digital traces always remain. I needed a plan calm enough to disarm them. I messaged Jordana first, saying I had thought things over and decided to forgive, that I didn't want to hurt Holden and wanted everything to end here. I used the softest words I could type, not because I believed her, but because I needed her to believe me.
Not long after, Corbin called back. His voice was so relieved I nearly laughed. That evening, he arrived at the Mandarin Oriental with a huge bouquet, playing the role of remorseful husband to perfection. On the drive home, he talked a lot about the future, about making things right, about how we should leave everything behind us. I listened, nodded when appropriate, stayed silent when needed. I knew when someone thinks they've escaped, that's when they let their guard down most. That night when we got home, everything looked eerily familiar. The living room, the bedroom, the bed, everything was the same except for me. When my husband stepped into the shower, the sound of running water steady in the background, I picked up his phone with a surprising calm. I knew exactly what I was looking for. I went to the trash folder in the video album where things thought to be gone were really just waiting to be found. And there it was, a video over an hour long. Sender, Jordana. Recipient, Holden. I opened it, though every part of me wanted to vomit. The image that appeared made me clutch the bed frame for support. They were in my bedroom, on the very bed I once believed to be the safest place in my life. The timestamp glared on the screen, perfectly matching the days I was in Vermont caring for my father after his accident. No more doubts, no more hypotheses, just a repulsive, naked truth staring me in the face. And in that moment, I knew all lines had been crossed, and there was no path left to return to. Strangely, I didn't cry, not because I had become numb, but because tears no longer served any purpose here. The pain inside me didn't explode, it sank, thickened, and then transformed into something entirely different, a cold, clear awareness. I sat down on the edge of the bed, phone still open in my hand, and for the first time I looked straight at the truth without turning away. If I kept silent, if I kept playing the role of the understanding wife, the only person who would pay the price would be me, not them. I would be the one sacrificed piece by piece for the comfort and deceit of those who had chosen betrayal. I deleted the video from the screen, returned the phone to its original place, then went to the guest bathroom and washed my hands for a long time, as if trying to scrub away something that had just clung to my skin. When I looked at myself in the mirror, the face staring back wasn't that of a woman who had just discovered her husband's affair. It was the face of someone who now understood the rules of the game and had no intention of losing. I knew one thing for sure. If I wanted to end this, I couldn't act out of rage. I needed time. I needed them to believe that things had calmed down. The very next morning, I messaged Jordana, just a short text, gentle in tone, saying I had thought it over and decided to forgive, that I didn't want to hurt Holden and wanted everything to stop here. I didn't wait for a reply.
I knew that just receiving that message would be enough to make her breathe easier. That evening, lying next to my husband, I spoke casually, as if it were just a passing thought before sleep. It had been 3 years since we hosted a big party at our house, both of us too busy with work. I said I missed the feeling of being surrounded by people, missed the laughter, the gathering under one roof. His eyes lit up instantly, the relief on his face was barely hidden. He suggested almost without thinking, why not throw an anniversary party for our 8th wedding year? Invite family, friends, colleagues for a warm gathering. I smiled and nodded in agreement, like a wife giving her marriage one more chance. But in my mind, that party already had a very different shape. I wasn't thinking of flowers or wine. I was thinking of lighting, sound, the guest list, and the moment when the truth would be put exactly where it belonged. I lay still in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the man beside me, and quietly began preparing the stage for an ending they never saw coming. The party was held at a luxurious hotel in the heart of Boston, where tall glass halls reflected the lights like a ready-made stage for moments that couldn't be taken back. I arrived earlier than the official start time, wearing a neutral-toned dress, makeup just right, smile placed perfectly. No one could have guessed that beneath that calm exterior was a script prepared down to the finest detail.
Guests began arriving in growing numbers. Both sides of the family, familiar faces from past gatherings, congratulations repeated like a ritual. Corbin's colleagues showed up in small groups, firm handshakes, polite work-scented chatter. Then I saw his boss walk in. Perfect suit, eyes sharp with the quiet scrutiny of someone who always cared about image and reputation. Everything unfolded flawlessly, like the textbook anniversary party of a model marriage in Boston. No cracks showing on the surface. And then, at the entrance to the hall, I saw Holden. He paused for a second before stepping forward, as if sensing something was off. Beside him was Jordana, hand lightly resting on her belly, face carefully made up, smile held tightly in place. Her eyes scanned the room, glanced past me, then quickly turned away. I walked over to greet them, polite, composed, like an old friend seeing familiar faces again. No one in that room knew that their presence tonight was the final piece I needed. As soft music played and glasses were raised in toasts, I stood in the center of the room, listening to the blended sound of laughter and chatter, and I knew with perfect clarity. This evening wasn't meant to save a marriage. It was built so the truth could have witnesses, and everyone who needed to see it was here tonight. As the clinking of glasses began to fade and all eyes started turning toward me in a familiar ritual, I stepped forward. I didn't take the microphone right away. I let the pause stretch a few seconds longer, just enough for the room to sync its breath with mine. Then I gave a small nod to the technician standing by the large screen behind me. The screen lit up. No introduction, no music, just raw footage, brutally clear. The video appeared. My husband and Jordana in a position no excuse could justify. A familiar space revealed itself within seconds. My bedroom, the bed, the nightstand lamp, even the framed print I had chosen. I heard someone gasp somewhere in the room. Corbin stood frozen, face drained of all color. Jordana stepped back half a pace, hand instinctively covering her stomach. As the video ended, before I said a word, the audio recording began. Jordana's voice, clear, unedited, undeniable. Every accusation, every veiled threat, the way she used Holden as a shield, the way she hinted that if I dared to speak, I would be seen as a jealous woman. I didn't need to look their way to know what was happening. Holden's head bowed, fists clenched as if trying to hold together something that had just shattered inside him. When the recording ended, I took a deep breath and made one final gesture. On the screen, a document appeared, plain black and white, emotionless, a DNA test result. Corbin's name clearly marked under biological father, the number 99% circled in bold as a verdict that needed no further explanation.
I heard a glass drop. Someone covered their mouth. Someone else turned to look at Corbin's boss as if awaiting his reaction. The entire hall fell silent. Not a whisper, not a murmur, only the heavy silence of those who had just witnessed the truth laid bare completely, irreversibly. I stood there, under the lights, not trembling, not crying, and I understood. From this moment forward, this story no longer belonged to anyone's words. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken loud enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. The silence lasted a few seconds more before Holden stepped forward. He didn't look at me first, he looked straight at Jordana. That gaze no longer belonged to a man about to marry, but to someone who had just woken up from a long, toxic dream. His voice was deep, clear, steady. He announced the wedding was off. No permission sought, no further explanation, just one sentence enough to sever over 10 years of attachment in front of a room full of people. Jordana stood frozen, lips moving as if trying to say something, but no one waited for her to speak. Everything afterward happened faster than I had expected. The whispers no longer held back. Phones came out, eyes shifted within minutes. For someone who lived on image like Jordana, this was the true collapse. Word spread through their social circles so fast she couldn't react in time. Her job at the jewelry store, the one she had once taken so much pride in, was gone just days later, ended by a short, cold phone call. The reputation she had carefully built unraveled faster than any explanation could salvage.
As for Corbin, he didn't need to wait until the next morning to understand the consequences. His boss had left the party early, his face filled with unmistakable disappointment and anger. A department head at an insurance company cannot survive after being publicly exposed for moral misconduct, especially when it unfolded in front of colleagues and clients. A few days later, he was fired. No argument, no negotiation. Every door he once thought secure now closed, one by one. I stood in the midst of all that ruin, not triumphant, not hollow. I simply felt one thing with stark clarity. When the truth is put in its rightful place, it doesn't need me to do anything else. The betrayers crumble under the weight of their own actions, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I no longer stood in the eye of the storm. I had stepped out of it. I filed for divorce not long after, on a strangely quiet morning in Boston. There were no tears, no hesitation, just a signature placed exactly where it needed to be, as if I were completing a necessary procedure to continue living. I left the 3-bedroom house with a garden, once called a home, and moved into a smaller, neater apartment, just enough for me and the silence I had neglected for far too long. The new space carried no old memories. It gave me a sense of lightness, like a deep breath after holding it in for too long. When things began to settle, I did something I had dreamed of for years, but kept postponing because of work and nameless responsibilities. I visited the animal shelter in Boston, where the smell of disinfectant blended with the familiar barking of lives waiting for another chance. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I just knew I was ready. And then I saw him, a canine dog, steady in stance, calm eyes, carefully trained but still carrying the guarded look of a past that had been abandoned. We looked at each other for a long time, as if we both understood that we had endured enough brokenness to truly appreciate the bond that matters. 2 days later, the shelter called me. I went back and brought him home. For the first time in years, I no longer returned to my apartment alone. The old house was sold not long after. 3 months later, the court issued its final ruling. Each of us would receive 50% of the assets, by the book. No bias, no pity. I walked out of the courtroom with a sense of completeness, not because of the money or the outcome, but because I hadn't lost myself in the process. When everything had quieted, I sat by the window in my new apartment, my canine dog resting by my feet, the city of Boston stretching out before me, and I understood something very clear, very simple. The truth doesn't need to scream. It dismantles liars all on its own. 6 months after everything fell apart, my life didn't return to noise, it simply got better.
quietly, day by day. I was appointed head of the cardiology department not because of my personal story, but because of the difficult cases I had followed through to the end, the clinical research I had never abandoned, and the long night shifts I stayed for just to ensure my patients were safe. When I received the appointment, I didn't feel like I had won anything. I simply felt that my abilities had finally been placed where they belonged, not overshadowed by a marriage that once drained the life out of me. Work took me further. I began attending cardiology conferences across the country, Chicago, San Diego, then New York. At an advanced symposium in Manhattan, amidst long panel discussions and data-packed slides, I met David. He didn't make an impression through charm, but through the way he listened. We stood beside each other after a presentation, then sat down and talked, first about new interventional techniques, about complex cases, about the tough decisions only someone in our field could understand. The conversation lasted an entire afternoon, and neither of us noticed time passing. I don't know when I began to love David. There was no lightning bolt, no rushed promises, just the calm that came with talking to someone who didn't make me feel like I had to be on guard, who didn't need me to explain my past. When I realized it, I smiled softly, not because of a new love, but because I knew I had truly entered a new chapter of life, one where I no longer loved out of lack or fear, but from a place of wholeness and freedom I had built for myself.
A year after I met David at that conference, we got married in a small, simple ceremony without fanfare, with only those who truly understood and wished us well. No dramatic vows, no grand declarations, just two grown people who had both survived their own heartbreaks, choosing to stay together out of respect and peace. 2 weeks after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. I remember that moment so vividly. Not panic, not fear, just a stillness filled with gratitude. David held me for a long time, then decided to move to Boston permanently. No hesitation, no persuasion needed, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The mornings that followed began to change. David would wake early, make my favorite breakfast, open the windows to let sunlight flood our little apartment while I sat at the table, hand on my belly, listening to the city slowly wake. On weekends, we went to the dog rescue center together, doing small things, walking dogs, cleaning kennels, donating food, but they filled me in a way I hadn't expected. My canine dog always walked beside us, calm and loyal, as if he too understood that this family was built on kind choices. 8 months later, I gave birth to a baby girl. She had David's eyes, deep and gentle, but her nose and mouth were so much like mine that I laughed every time I looked at her. It wasn't a miracle, it was simply the natural result of a life finally set back on course. On those early nights, while she slept in her crib, our canine dog lay beside her, unmoving, quietly guarding her sleep like an old soldier who had found a new reason to stay. I stood there in the quiet room of a Boston night, looking at my small family, and understood something beautifully simple. Happiness doesn't come from winning over someone or proving something to the past. It comes when we're brave enough to leave what hurts us and patient enough to rebuild our lives with kind choices, one day at a time. That's my story. I don't share it to prove that I'm stronger than anyone else, but to say this: a woman doesn't have to scream to be respected. Sometimes all it takes is clarity to walk away, courage to speak the truth, and the patience to rebuild life in the kindest way possible for herself. And if this story resonates with you, please click like to support me, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you won't miss future stories. Stories about truth, boundaries, and how a woman can begin again, slowly but firmly.